There was a name that even the strongest wolves refused to speak aloud. Not the name of a king, not the name of a warrior, and not the name of any beast born with claws sharper than memory itself. It was the name of a shadow, a whisper that moved through the ancient territories like sickness, through blood silent and sure, leaving behind nothing but cold bodies and eyes that would never close again. For 3 generations, this shadow had walked among the wolves of the Grey March. 11 Alpha Kings had fallen, 11 stone seats left empty, 11 great halls that believed their walls were strong enough, their guards sharp enough, their power absolute enough to keep death outside where it belonged. And every single one of them had been wrong. No one had ever seen him coming. No one had ever lived long enough to say they had seen him leave. The packs whispered that he was not born of any wolf mother, that he had crawled out of the dark between the stars, and that the moon herself had turned her face away the night he first drew blood. They called him the Shadow, and they were right to fear him. But this story is not about him. Not really. This story is about the one wolf who finally saw him, the one wolf that no one had ever thought to count, the one wolf who saved a king and shook the entire ancient world of the Grey March to its deepest roots. This is the story of Ren, and it will not let you rest easy once you have heard it. The village of Ember Hollow sat low in a valley where the hills rose sharp on both sides and the trees grew so thick that even midday felt like dusk. The pack that lived there was not small, but it was not one of the great ones either. And every wolf inside those borders knew exactly where they stood in the order of things. Rank was everything in the old world. Rank was something you felt in your bones before anyone ever said a word to you about it. An alpha walked into a room and the air itself changed, and your shoulders pulled down without you meaning them to, and your eyes dropped before your mind caught up with your body. A beta stood tall and certain, and when they gave a command, your legs moved before your thoughts did, because that was simply how things worked in the Grey March territories. And an omega, well, an omega was the last word in a sentence that no one ever bothered to finish because the answer was always the same, and no one felt the need to say it out loud anymore. Ren was an omega. She had known it since the morning she came of age and felt the bond of her rank settle into her like stones dropping into still water. Heavy and without fuss, just a quiet and complete sinking. She was not angry about it, and she was not broken by it, because Ren had learned very early that anger cost energy, and she did not have energy to waste on things the moon had already decided for her. She was slight in frame with dark eyes set wide apart that caught the light in a way that made people uncomfortable if she held their gaze too long. So she had learned to look slightly to the side of people's faces when she spoke, just enough to make them feel seen without feeling studied. Her hair was the color of deep earth after rain, and she kept it braided tight against her head because loose hair was one more thing to manage, and Ren did not keep anything around her that had no purpose. She lived in the lower quarter of Ember Hollow, where the huts were smaller and the cooking fires burned lower, and where the smell of the tanning pits drifted in at night when the wind turned wrong. She mended things mostly, fur wraps and leather straps and the woven grass baskets that the elder women used to carry grain from the storehouse. Her hands were steady and her work was clean, and she did not charge more than was fair. People brought her torn things and she fixed them and they left, and they did not stay to talk. And that was the shape of her days. And she did not mind it, but the truth, the real and private truth that Ren kept folded tight inside her chest was that she noticed everything. She noticed the way Brock the beta guard shifted his weight to his left foot when he was about to raise his voice. And she noticed the way Elder Maris always touched the side of her own jaw when she was lying about the grain count. And she noticed the way the village dogs went silent in the east quarter, a full breath before strangers crested the hill road. She did not know why she noticed these things, and she did not know what to do with them. So she kept them folded away and kept mending torn things, and kept her eyes to the side of people's faces, and kept her mouth quiet. That was how she had always lived, and she had believed fully and without question that it was how she would always live. Then one afternoon 10 years ago, everything had changed. Ren had been 16 when her mother died. Not from sickness and not from age and not from any of the things that take people gently in their sleep. Her mother had died from exhaustion, from being worked past the point where a body can recover, from being an omega in a pack where omegas were tools to be used up and thrown away when they stopped being useful. Ren had tried to warn them, had tried to tell the pack overseer that her mother needed rest, that her hands shook when she carried water, that her breathing sounded wrong at night. But no one listened to omegas when they spoke about other omegas. And so her mother had worked until her heart simply stopped, and Ren had held her in the dirt outside the tanning pits while the sun set and no one came to help. That was the night Ren learned that seeing things did not matter if no one believed you when you spoke. But someone had been watching, an old beta warrior named Falk, who had served the great warlords in the eastern reaches before his fighting days ended, and he came to Ember Hollow to live out his years in something like peace. He had fought in wars that most wolves only heard about in stories. He had stood beside kings and cut down enemies that other men ran from. And he had learned in all those years of violence and blood to see the things that mattered beneath the things that were loud. He found Ren 3 days after her mother's burial, sitting alone by the stream that ran through the lower quarter, staring at the water like it held answers. You saw it coming, Falk had said. His voice was rough from age and old wounds, but it was not unkind. You tried to tell them she needed rest. Ren had said nothing. There was nothing to say. Falk sat down beside her, his old knees creaking, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You have the sight, girl. Not magic, not prophecy, just eyes that see what others miss. Patterns, the way things connect before they break. Ren had looked at him then, and she had not looked to the side of his face. She had looked directly at him, and she had said, What good is seeing if no one listens? Falk had smiled, and it was a sad smile, but it was real. None, he said, unless you learn to use it when it matters most, and unless you learn to hide it the rest of the time. For the next 8 years, Falk had taught her, not how to fight because Ren was not built for fighting, and Falk was old enough to know that not every battle was won with claws and teeth. He taught her to read the small things, the way a man's fingers twitched when he was about to lie, the way a blade sat wrong in its sheath when it had been drawn recently and put back in haste, the way shadows moved when someone was trying not to be seen. And he taught her the bone code, the old language that assassins and spies had used for generations to mark territory and signal intent. Symbols carved into wood or stone that meant things like target confirmed and danger here and proceed with caution. Most wolves had forgotten the bone code even existed. But Falk remembered, and he made sure Ren remembered too. He also taught her one other thing, and it was the most important lesson of all. He taught her to keep what she knew folded inside her chest because Omegas who were too useful became tools, and tools got used up. Falk had died 2 years ago, quietly in his sleep, the way old warriors almost never got to die. And Ren had stood at his pyre and promised him silently that she would use what he had given her when it matters most, that she would not waste it on small things. She had not known when she made that promise how soon it would be tested. The summons came on a morning when the sky was low and gray and the air smelled like rain that had not yet decided to fall. It did not come to Ren directly because things rarely came to an Omega directly in those days. It came to the pack elder Maris, and Maris passed it down to the Beta Guard captain, and the Beta Guard captain passed it along to the workers' overseer. And finally, on the 4th day after the original summons had arrived, it reached Ren in the form of a young errand boy named Pike, who looked deeply uninterested in the task he had been given. You are wanted at Blackthorn Keep, Pike said, not quite looking at her, picking at the frayed edge of his belt. Ren set down the basket she was mending and looked at the side of his face and said, By whose word? Pike shrugged one shoulder and said, The king's own word, they say, but I do not know why they would want someone from the lower quarter. And then he left because he had said the thing he was sent to say, and the rest was not his concern. Ren sat very still for a long moment after he was gone. Blackthorn Keep was not just a great hall, it was the seat of the Alpha King, and the Alpha King was not just any king. His name was Corvus. And Corvus was the kind of name that made veteran warriors press their backs to walls when he entered a room just to have stone behind them. He was said to be fierce in the way old storms were fierce, not loud at the start, not rushing, just building and building until you realized too late that the sky above you had gone entirely wrong. He had ruled the Grey March territories for 11 years. And in those 11 years, 3 assassination attempts had been made against him. And all 3 had ended with the assassins in pieces and the pieces sent back to whoever had hired them, wrapped in the hiring party's own colors. He was not a king who asked for mercy, and he was not a king who gave it without cost. And Ren had absolutely no idea why his summons had found its way to the lower quarter of a mid-standing pack on the edge of his territory. But she folded the basket she was mending, and she banked her small fire, and she put on her second-best wrap because her best one had a tear she had not yet fixed. And she packed a small bundle with dried meal and smoked root in the bone knife that Falk had given her years ago, wrapped carefully so it would not cut through the cloth. And she set out on the road toward Blackthorn Keep before the sun reached the top of the sky. The road was 3 days long, and Ren walked it mostly alone. On the first day, she passed through the outer villages where the fields were wider and the houses sat closer together, and where people looked at her and then looked away quickly because an Omega traveling alone was either desperate or dangerous, and no one wanted to find out which. She slept that night in a low hollow where the road dipped close to a stream, and she ate from her small pouch of provisions without thinking too hard about how much she would need for the journey back. On the second morning, she passed a group of warriors heading the same direction. Large men with thick necks and the wide stances of trained fighters wearing the black and ash-gray colors of packs that served under Corvus's banner. They did not speak to her, and she did not expect them to. But she watched them the way she watched everything, quietly and from the side. One of them had a blade on his hip that was tied with the wrong knot, loose at the inner loop. The kind of knot that looked secure at a glance but would let the blade shift in the sheath if he moved fast. And it bothered Ren the way a crooked stone in a wall bothered her. Not dangerous to her, just wrong in a way that sat uneasily in her mind. And there was something else about that man, something in the way his eyes moved. Not over the surfaces of things the way ordinary warriors' eyes moved. Not following the natural pull of activity and sound, but in a slow and deliberate pattern that covered the road in sections, the way a guard covers a perimeter. Methodically, without lingering. Ren filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that did not fit, and she kept walking. That night, she stayed at a roadside inn where the beds were straw pallets on a dirt floor, and the food was thin soup that tasted like it had been made 3 days ago. She sat in the corner with her bowl and listened to the warriors at the next table talk in low voices about things they thought no one else was hearing. One of them said, "You heard about the Northern King, found dead in his own hall 2 months back. Best guards in the Grey March. Strongest walls. Did not matter." Another said, "They say it was the shadow." The first one made a sound like a bitter laugh and said, "They always say it is the shadow. Been saying it for 30 years. 3 kings in my lifetime. All dead in their own halls. And no one ever catches him." The second warrior was quiet for a moment. Then he said quieter, "What kind of wolf kills kings and never gets caught?" The first one did not answer. And Ren, sitting in her corner with her thin soup, felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, just the particular kind of tension that comes from hearing a shape you do not yet fully understand, but know you will need to. On the third day, Ren saw Blackthorn Keep for the first time. It rose from a flat-topped hill like a fist rising from a forearm, sudden and sure and impossible to miss. The hall was built from dark gray stone and old timber that had gone black with age, and the walls were hung with the pelts of wolves who had challenged Corvus and lost. Not a cruelty exactly, more of a language that every wolf who came to that hill understood before they ever passed through the gate. The gate guards looked Ren over when she arrived, and she could see the question in their faces. Small Omega woman from the lower quarter. No weapons visible, no colors, no rank worth mentioning. She gave them her name and said she had been summoned, and one of them went inside and she waited standing still in the cooling air of late afternoon while the wind carried smoke and the smell of roasted grain down from the hall above. The guard came back and his face had changed slightly, just around the eyes, the way a face changes when it has been given information it did not expect. "You are to be taken to the inner hall," he said, and his voice was careful in the way voices get when people are trying not to show confusion. Ren followed him inside, through the outer yard where more warriors stood in groups talking low, through a second gate of heavy timber, and into the body of the hall itself, where the ceilings were high and the fire pits burned long and low down the center of the room. There were people here of every rank, advisors in fine stitched wraps, warriors in their colors, elders with the bone markers of their offices hanging at their chests, and all of them turned to look at Ren as she was walked through the room. She kept her eyes to the side of their faces and kept her steps even and kept her breathing slow. At the far end of the hall on a raised stone seat that was not quite a throne, but was close enough that no one called it anything else, sat Corvus. He was large the way mountains are large, not loud about it, just simply and entirely there, taking up the space around him in a way that made the space feel smaller even though the hall was vast. His hair was dark and unbound, and his jaw was set hard, and his eyes were on Ren before she had taken 3 steps into the room, and they did not move off her as she walked the length of the fire pits to stand before him. Ren stopped at the respectful distance. She dipped her head once, not low enough to be submissive, but not so shallow as to be bold, and she looked at the side of his jaw and waited. The hall was very quiet. Corvus looked at her for a long moment, and his face gave nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then he said in a voice that was quieter than she had expected from a man his size, "You are Ren of Ember Hollow." She said, "I am." He said, "You mend things." She said, "I do." He was quiet again for another moment, and then he said, "I was told that you see things that others miss, and that you have never once been wrong about what you have seen." And his eyes had not moved off her face even once since she entered the room. Ren said nothing because no one had ever said that to her before in those exact words, and she was not sure how to answer a thing she had never been told about herself. Corvus leaned forward slightly in his seat and said, "Someone is going to try to kill me, and I believe they will try it soon. And I believe they will try it here inside this hall during the gathering feast that begins in 3 days. The fire pits burned low and steady between them, and the hall was very still. He said, "My guards are the finest I have ever trained. My advisors are sharp. My walls are tight. And in 11 years, no one has put a blade within reach of me inside these walls." And his voice was level and even in a way that made every word land cleanly. He said, "And yet I am not easy." He reached into the folds of his wrap and pulled out a piece of parchment, folded once. He held it out toward her, and Ren stepped forward and took it. She unfolded it carefully, and what she saw made the cold thing in her chest tighten. It was a bone code symbol, carved in ink but precise, the kind of precision that came from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And what it said in the old language that Falk had taught her was simple and absolute: inevitable death, already in motion. Ren looked up from the parchment and met Corvus's eyes directly for the first time. Just for a breath. Just long enough to read the thing in his face that she had been reading slowly from the edge since she walked in. And what she read there was not fear, because Corvus was not a man who feared in the ordinary way. What she read there was certainty. The cold and clear certainty of a man who knows that something is already in motion and cannot yet see where it will land. She looked back to the side of his jaw and said, "Why trust an Omega you have never met?" Corvus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A man named Falk wrote to me a year before he died. He said you saw a poisoner at the market in Ember Hollow when you were 12 years old. He said you saved 30 lives that day. He said you never wanted credit for it. And he said that kind of integrity is rare in any rank." Ren felt something twist in her chest. Falk. Of course it had been Falk. Even in death, he was still teaching her. Corvus said, "I need someone I can trust. Someone who sees what warriors miss. Someone who will tell me the truth even when the truth is dangerous." He looked at her steadily and said, "I want you in this hall. I want your eyes open. And I want you to tell me what you see." Ren was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I will need to move freely through the hall and the grounds before the feast begins, without guards following me." Corvus's eyes did not change, but something in his shoulders settled just barely. And he said, "It will be arranged." And that was how Ren of the lower quarter of Ember Hollow, Omega Mender of Torn Things woman, that no one counted, came to stand inside the walls of Blackthorn Keep 3 days before someone tried to end the life of the most feared Alpha King in all the Greymarch territories. She did not know yet that the assassin was already inside the walls. She did not know yet that he had been inside since before she arrived. And she did not know yet that the thing sleeping inside her, the thing she had always folded away and kept quiet, was not just a habit of noticing, but something older and sharper, and far more dangerous than anything she had ever let herself believe about herself. But she would know all of it before the feast fire burned down to ash. They gave Ren a small room near the back of the inner hall close to the grain stores. And she understood, without being told, that this was the room they gave to people they did not know what to do with. People who had been invited by the king but did not fit anywhere in the order of things that everyone else understood. The room had a straw mat, a clay water pot, and a single narrow window that looked out over the inner yard. And Ren set her bundle down on the mat and stood at that window for a long time, looking out at the yard the way she had looked at 100 rooms before. Reading it slowly, finding the low places and the hidden channels where things moved beneath the surface. The yard was busy with preparation for the gathering feast. Wolves moved in every direction carrying timber and clay pots and bundles of dried herbs, setting up the long stone tables that would run the length of the great hall, beating the old woven mats clean against the outer wall, hauling water from the deep well in the far corner. Ren watched all of it with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. And slowly, the way a picture in still water becomes clear, once you stop disturbing the surface, the shape of the yard settled into something she could read. She saw where the guards changed shifts and when. She saw which doorways were watched and which were not. She saw the pattern of the servants' movement, the paths they walked, the places they stopped, the moments when the yard went briefly thin and unobserved. And she saw something else. On the morning of her first full day at Blackthorn Keep, just before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, Ren saw a man cross the inner yard from the direction of the wood store. He was moving toward the hall-side entrance with a bundle of cut timber over his shoulder. He was dressed as a wood carrier, rough cloth and worn leather. His face lowered under the weight of the load, and he moved with the unhurried ease of someone who had been doing this task for a long time. He looked like a wood carrier. He moved like a wood carrier. And every guard in the yard looked straight past him, the way people look past things that fit perfectly into the world around them. But Ren watched him from her narrow window, and something in her chest went very still and very cold. The way the air goes still and cold just before a storm breaks. It was the wood. The bundle on his shoulder was not cut from the same timber as the rest of the wood piled against the outer wall. The grain was finer, the color slightly darker, And it had not been cut the way working wood was cut, rough and fast and practical. It had been cut neatly, almost carefully, as though the shape of it mattered for a reason that had nothing to do with burning. And there was something else. Something about the way the man moved. His face was lowered, yes, but his eyes were not. His eyes were moving in a pattern, a slow and deliberate pattern that covered the yard in sections, not the way a wood carrier's eyes moved, the way a hunter's eyes moved. Wren stood at her window and watched him carry the bundle through the side entrance, and she watched the door close behind him. And she stood there for a long time after her hands very still at her sides. She had seen that man before, 2 days ago, on the road, among the warriors heading toward Blackthorn Keep, the one with the blade tied wrong, and now he was here, inside the walls, dressed as a wood carrier, moving through the yard like he belonged. Wren did not go to the guards, not yet. She went to the hall itself because she needed to see more before she said anything. And because Wren had learned very early that an Omega who raised an alarm and turned out to be wrong paid a price that was not fair and did not matter to the ones collecting it. She moved through the hall the way she moved through every space, quietly, purposefully, making herself look as though she had a task and knew exactly where she was going. The hall was full of workers still setting up for the feast, and no one looked at her twice because no one ever did. And for once in her life, she was grateful for that in a way that went deeper than habit. She found the side passage where the wood carrier had entered and followed it to the inner storeroom where the feast wood was stacked. And she stood in the doorway and let her eyes move slowly across the stacked timber. The bundle from that morning had been placed near the back, set against the wall behind the older wood, which meant it would be reached last, which meant someone had planned for it to be there at a specific time. Not now, but later, when the feast fires were burning low and needed feeding, and a servant would reach to the back of the stack without thinking about what they were pulling from it. Wren crossed the room and crouched beside the bundle. She pressed her fingers along the grain of the wood and felt the hollow space inside it before she had even looked, because her fingers knew the difference between solid timber and something carved out and refilled. The way her eyes knew the difference between a real knot and a false one. She looked. The center log had been hollowed and sealed again with pine resin, and inside the hollow, wrapped in dark cloth to keep it from rattling, was a small clay vessel, no bigger than her closed fist, stoppered tight with wax. Wren did not open it. She knew what it was without opening it because the smell was there even through the wax in the cloth and the resin, faint and sweet in a way that had no business being sweet. The smell of ember root paste, the kind that had no taste and no color and no smell strong enough to catch in a cup of dark wine. And that stopped a wolf's heart as quietly and completely as a hand pressed over a candle flame. Wren sat back on her heels and breathed slowly and looked at the clay vessel in the hollow log and thought about everything it meant. The assassin was not coming from outside the walls. The assassin was already inside. He had been inside long enough to plant this, to learn the timing of the wood stores, to know which bundle would be reached for at which moment during the feast. He was patient, and he was thorough, and he was very, very good. And he was planning to kill Corvus, not with a blade in the open, but with poison in the feast fire. Smoke and ember root rising together into the hall, invisible in the cedar smoke, odorless to anyone who did not know exactly what they were smelling for. Drifting over the head table where the king would sit and breathe deeply in the warmth of a feast fire all evening, until his heart simply stopped. Wren wrapped the vessel back in its cloth carefully. She set it in the exact position she had found it because she did not want the assassin to know she had found it. Not yet. And she rose and walked back through the passage and through the hall and back to her small room near the grain stores. And she sat on her straw mat and looked at her steady hands and thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. She could go to Corvus now and tell him everything. He would believe her or he would not. And either way, the assassin would know his plan had been discovered and he would change it. And whatever his next plan was would be something she had not yet seen and had not yet found. And a threat you cannot see is worse than a threat you have already located. Wren pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed out slowly through her nose. And she made a decision that was not the safe decision, and was not the small decision, and was not the kind of decision that Omegas were supposed to make in the world of the Grey March. But she made it anyway because it was the right one. And Wren had always known the difference between those two things even when no one gave her credit for it. She was going to find out everything the assassin had planned. She was going to learn every piece of it. And she was going to be ready in the hall when he made his move. She would not warn the guards yet. She would not move the vessel. She would let the plan stay exactly where it was, and she would stay exactly where she needed to be. And when the moment came, she would not miss it. She had never been wrong about what she saw, and she was not wrong now. And the only question left was whether the thing sleeping inside her, that old and sharp and quiet thing that folk had named and nurtured, would be awake enough to do what the moment required of it when the time finally came. Outside her narrow window, the inner yard went on with its preparation, and the wood store sat quiet in the hall. And somewhere inside the walls of Blackthorn Keep, the assassin moved through his day like a shadow, unhurried, certain, and completely unaware that a pair of wide-set dark eyes had already found him. The first full day Wren spent inside Blackthorn Keep, she did not speak to anyone except to answer when she was spoken to. And no one spoke to her much because she was an Omega in a hall full of ranked wolves, and her presence was noted only in the way that a small piece of furniture is noted, as a thing that exists and takes up a small amount of space and presents no particular interest. This suited Wren completely. She moved through the hall and the yard and the passages and the outer buildings, the way water moves through a stone channel, following the shape of the space, going where the space allowed, making no sound and leaving no mark. She was learning the hall the way she had always learned things, slowly and completely, building the picture from the edges inward until she could close her eyes and walk any path inside those walls without error. And she found three more things. The assassin had placed a strip of dried cloth soaked in ember root oil tucked behind the bracket of the torch nearest the king's seat, thin enough that the heat of the torch would eventually dry it to nothing and release the oil into the air above the table in a slow and invisible drift. There was a small bone carving wedged into the gap between two stones in the wall behind the high seat. Wren did not touch it because she could not tell yet what it was for and did not want to disturb it before she understood its purpose. But she looked at it closely, and she recognized the symbols carved into its surface. Old marks, the kind Falk had taught her, the kind that said things in a language most wolves had forgotten. This one said, "Inner Council, verified target. Proceed." And that made Wren's chest go cold in a different way, because it meant the assassin had not come alone. It meant someone inside Corvus's inner circle had confirmed that the king would be exactly where the assassin needed him to be, that the plan was sound, that it was time to move forward. There was a traitor inside Blackthorn Keep, and Wren did not yet know who. The third thing she found was another clay vessel, smaller than the first, set into the hollow of a split timber in the wall of the outer passage that led from the kitchen to the feast hall, stoppered the same way, smelling the same way. Placed so that anyone brushing past it in the narrow passage would not notice they had cracked the wax seal and released what was inside into the air of the quarter. The assassin was not relying on one plan. He had layered them one inside the other, the way a careful hunter layers traps along a game trail, so that if the animal avoids the first, it meets the second, and if it avoids the second, it meets the third. He was thorough in a way that made Wren's chest tighten. Not with fear exactly, but with the particular kind of tension that comes from recognizing something very skilled and very dangerous and knowing that you are the only thing standing between it and the thing it is aimed at. 2 days until the feast, and Wren had work to do. Wren watched the wood carrier again on the second morning, and this time she was positioned better, standing near the grain store entrance with a basket she had borrowed from a kitchen worker, looking like exactly what she appeared to be. An Omega doing a small task in the vicinity of a busy yard. He crossed the yard at the same hour, carrying an empty sack this time, heading toward the outer building where the dry goods were stored. And as he passed within a few body lengths of her, Wren kept her face completely empty and her eyes aimed just past him. And she read him in the time it took him to cross her line of sight. His face was plain, the kind of face that was designed, she understood now, to be forgotten the moment you stopped looking at it. Middle height, middle build, nothing remarkable, nothing that would catch in memory. His eyes were pale and set close, and they moved in that same deliberate pattern she had noticed before. Not over the surfaces of things, not following the natural pull of activity and sound, but covering the yard in sections, methodically, the way a guard covers a perimeter, the way a predator maps terrain. He did not look at people. He looked at positions. He looked at angles. He was reading the yard the same way Wren read it, and the understanding of that settled into her chest like a cold stone finding the bottom of a deep well. He was good. He was very good. And she was certain of it now, the one who had placed everything she had found, and probably other things she had not found yet. He had been doing all of it in plain sight of guards and workers and advisors, and not one of them had seen anything but a plain-faced supply worker doing an ordinary task. Wren stood very still with her borrowed basket and watched him disappear into the dry goods building. And she thought about the hollow log and the torch bracket and the passage vessel and the bone carving that said someone in the inner council had betrayed their king. And she thought about how many layers this man had built into his plan, how patient he had been, how certain. and she thought about the fact that he had no idea she existed. That to him, if he had noticed her at all, she was nothing, invisible, an omega. The last word in a sentence no one bothered to finish. And for the first time in her life, Ren was grateful for her rank in a way that had nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with survival. Because her invisibility was the only advantage she had, and she could not afford to waste it. On the second afternoon, Ren went to Corvus. She asked to speak to him privately, and the advisor who received the request, a sharp-eyed woman named Sable, looked at Ren with a very particular kind of expression, the kind that said what it meant without saying it aloud, which was that Omega women from lower quarter packs did not typically request private audiences with the Alpha King, but Ren had been summoned by Corvus himself, and whatever reason he had for summoning her had been enough to bring her to Blackthorn Keep. So Sable went inside and came back with a different expression, and she led Ren to a smaller inner room where Corvus was sitting alone with a clay cup and a skin of dark water, and the look of a man who had not slept well in several days. He looked up when Ren entered, and his eyes were sharp even through the tiredness in them. Ren crossed the room and stood before him, and she said clearly and without decoration, "The plan to kill you is already inside these walls. It has been inside since before I arrived, and the man running it is registered in your hall under a false name from the eastern supply villages." Corvus was very still. Ren continued, and she told him about the hollow log and the ember root vessel, about the torch bracket and the passage and the bone carving she had found wedged between the stones behind his seat. She described the wood carrier in the yard, his height and build and pale, close-set eyes, and the way those eyes moved in sections across the perimeter, and she described the layering of the plan, the way it was designed to catch him even if one part failed, and she told him all of it in the same even voice she used to tell people the cost of mending a fur wrap. Corvus did not speak until she was finished. Then he was quiet for a moment more, and then he said, "How certain are you?" Ren said completely. He looked at her for a long time, and she let him look because she understood that he was not doubting her. He was measuring the shape of what she had just given him and finding the edges of it. Then he said, "What do you need?" And the fact that he said that and not any of the other things he could have said told Ren everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was underneath the feared name in the stone seat. She said, "I need you to do nothing different. Nothing in the hall changes. No guard moves, no arrangement shifts. No one in your court knows what I have told you except you." Corvus raised one dark eyebrow just slightly. Ren said if the assassin sees any change, he adjusts, and the next plan he makes will be one I have not found yet. Corvus looked at his clay cup, then back at her, and he said, "You want to let him run his plan so that you can meet it?" Ren said, "Yes," he said. "And what happens at the feast when the moment comes?" Ren said, "I will be there." And she held his gaze directly for the first time, not to the side of his jaw, but straight into those tired amber eyes. And she said, "Trust me." The room was quiet for a long moment after that, and then Corvus said, "The bone carving. You said it meant someone in my inner council has betrayed me." Ren said, "Yes." Corvus leaned back in his seat, and for the first time since Ren had met him, he looked old. Not in years, but in the weight of years. The way a stone looks old when it has been holding up a wall for too long. He said, "There are 5 in my inner council. Hadrian, my trade master. Rorik, my head warrior. Sable, my chief advisor. Idris, the spiritual elder. And Bryony, my cousin and diplomat." He looked at Ren and said, "Which one?" Ren said, "I do not know yet. The code only says one of them placed the carving. But I will watch them at the feast, and I will know." Corvus was quiet again. Then he said, "If you are wrong about any of this, it will cost you more than you understand." Ren said, "I know." He said, "And if you are right and you fail, it will cost me my life." Ren said, "I know that too." Corvus studied her face for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her, and his hand was warm and rough and larger than hers, in a way that should have made her feel small but somehow did not. He said, "If you die protecting me, I will never forgive myself." Ren looked at their joined hands, then back at his face, and she said, "Then do not let me die." Something moved in Corvus's expression then, something that was not quite a smile but was close enough. And he said, "Very well, Ren of Ember Hollow. We will do this your way." He released her hand, and Ren stepped back, and she dipped her head once, and she left the room and walked back through the hall toward her small room near the grain stores. Her hands were steady, her mind was very clear. The feast was one day away, and somewhere in the hall the assassin was finishing his preparations, certain that he had not been seen, certain that tonight he would do what he had come to do, and walk out of Blackthorn Keep through a door that no one was watching. He had been certain of that same thing in every hall he had ever entered, and he had always been right, until now. That night alone in her small room, Ren did not sleep. She sat on her straw mat with her back against the wall and the bone knife in her lap. And she let her mind go to the place it did not want to go, the place where fear lived, the place she had kept locked away since her mother died. What if she was wrong? What if the wood carrier was exactly what he appeared to be, and she had built a threat out of small details that meant nothing? What if she spoke, and Corvus acted, and the assassin was someone else entirely, and Ren had wasted the king's trust on her own paranoia? What if she was right but not fast enough? What if the assassin had a plan she had not found a layer deeper than the ones she had already seen? What if she failed, and Corvus died, and the last thing he thought before the poison stopped his heart was that he had been a fool to trust in Omega? Ren pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed slowly through her nose. And she heard Falk's voice in her head. Not a memory exactly, just the echo of 1,000 lessons distilled into one certainty. You were never helpless, Ren. You always saw. You just did not trust yourself. Trust yourself now. Ren opened her eyes, and she looked at the bone knife in her lap. And she thought about her mother who had died soon because no one listened when she spoke. And she thought about Falk who had taught her to see and to trust what she saw. And she thought about Corvus who had looked at her across that small room and said, "Trust me," and had not flinched when she said the same thing back to him. And she made herself a promise. The same promise she had made at Falk's pyre 2 years ago. She would not waste this. She would not fail. And when the moment came, she would be ready. Outside her narrow window, the moon was rising, and the inner yard was quiet. And somewhere in the darkness, the assassin slept the sleep of the certain, of the patient, of the one who had never once been stopped. But Ren did not sleep, and she would not sleep until this was finished. The third day was the longest day Ren had ever lived. She moved through Blackthorn Keep with the same quiet purpose she always moved with, but everything felt different now, sharper. The edges of things too clear, the sounds too loud, every shadow holding the possibility of the man she was hunting. She checked each of the assassin's traps one final time. The hollow log was still in the wood store, sitting exactly where she had found it. The cloth strip was still behind the torch bracket. The vessel was still in the passage wall. The bone carving was still wedged between the stones. Everything was exactly where it had been, and everything was waiting for the moment its maker had chosen for it. And Ren was waiting too, in her own way, with her borrowed basket and her plain face and her wide dark eyes that missed nothing. She saw the wood carrier 3 more times that day. Once in the morning crossing the yard with a load of clay pots. Once at midday standing near the well, talking to another worker in low tones. And once in the late afternoon walking the perimeter of the outer wall in a pattern that looked casual but was not. Each time Ren made herself invisible. She folded herself into the background the way she had been doing her entire life. And each time the assassin's eyes passed over her without catching, without holding. Because to him she was nothing. But Ren saw him, and she was learning him. The way he moved, the rhythm of his breath, the small tells in his posture that said when he was relaxed and when he was not. She was building a map of him in her mind, so that when the time came, she would know where he would be before he got there. Late in the afternoon, Ren saw something that made her entire body go cold. She was standing near the entrance to the kitchens, watching the preparations for the feast. And across the yard near the stables, she saw the wood carrier speaking to a man in fine robes. One of the inner council, and even from a distance, Ren could see the tension in both their bodies. The way they stood close but not too close. The way their eyes did not quite meet. The language of conspiracy written in the space between them. The man in fine robes was Hadrian, the trade master. Middle-aged and nervous in the way that men who have something to hide are always nervous. He had the look of someone who had made a choice he could not unmake and was trying very hard to convince himself it had been the right one. Hadrian said something low and quick, and the wood carrier nodded once. A single brief movement, and then Hadrian walked away toward the hall, and the wood carrier stood alone for a moment, and then he turned, and for just a breath his pale eyes swept across the yard, and they landed on Ren. She did not move, did not breathe, did not let a single muscle in her face change. She stood with her basket and her empty expression and let his gaze pass over her the way it had passed over her a dozen times before. And it did. It passed. And he looked away, and he walked toward the outer buildings. And Ren stood in the shadow of the kitchen entrance and felt her heart beating hard against her ribs. He had looked at her, directly at her, and he had seen nothing, because she was an Omega, and Omegas were invisible. Ren let out a slow breath, and she made herself move. One step, then another, back toward her room, because if she stood there any longer, she was going to break, and she could not afford to break. Not yet. She reached her room and closed the door and sat on the straw mat, and she let herself shake, just for a moment. just long enough to let the fear out so it would not choke her later. Then she stopped shaking, and she pulled the bone knife from beneath her mat, and she held it in her hands and felt the weight of it. The balance. The edge that Falk had sharpened for her years ago, and that she had kept sharp ever since. She was not a warrior. She had never trained to fight, but Falk had shown her where to strike if she ever needed to. The places on a body where a blade would end a threat quickly and completely. The shoulder, the side of the neck, the space between the ribs. Ren had never used that knowledge, had never thought she would need to. But she thought about it now, and she made herself ready for the possibility that tomorrow night she might have to. She practiced the motion, the way Falk had taught her, fast and sure and without hesitation, because hesitation in a moment like that was the same as failure. She practiced it until her hands stopped shaking, until the movement felt like something her body knew instead of something her mind was trying to remember. And then she wrapped the knife carefully in cloth and tucked it into the folds of her wrap, and she sat on her mat and waited for the sun to set. The gathering feast would begin at sundown, and Ren would be ready. But first there was one more thing she needed to do. She waited until the yard outside her window had gone quiet, until the last of the workers had finished their tasks and gone to prepare themselves for the feast. And then she slipped out of her room and moved through the darkening halls of Blackthorn Keep. She went to the wood store first, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the hollow log one last time, and she whispered a promise to it, to the plan it represented, to the man who had placed it there with such care. "I see you," she said, "and you will not succeed." Then she went to the torch bracket near the king's seat, and she looked at the cloth strips soaked in ember root oil, and she whispered the same promise. And then she went to the passage, and she looked at the vessel wedged into the wall, and she said it again. "I see you." She did not touch anything, did not move anything, because the plan had to stay exactly where it was, but she needed to say it, needed to speak the thing that no one else could speak, because silence was what had always made her invisible. And invisibility was her weapon now. But it would not always be. When this was over, when Corvus was safe and the assassin was stopped, Ren would speak, and people would listen, because she would have earned the right to be heard. But not yet, not tonight. Tonight she would be silent, and she would be invisible, and she would use both of those things to do what no warrior in Blackthorn Keep had been able to do. She would save the king. Ren returned to her room as the sun touched the western hills, and she changed into the plain feast clothes she had brought with her. Simple cloth, nothing fine, nothing that would draw attention, and she tucked the bone knife into her wrap where it would not be seen but could be reached in a single motion. And then she stood at her window and watched the yard fill with guests, alphas and betas from every corner of the Grey March territories, all of them dressed in their finest colors, all of them carrying the energy of wolves who had traveled far to be seen in a powerful place. The torches were being lit, the fire pits were blazing, and the smell of roasted meat and dark berry wine was beginning to drift through the hall. It was beginning. Ren left her room and walked through the passages toward the great hall, and as she walked, she felt the weight of the knife against her ribs, and she felt the weight of everything that was about to happen, and she felt the fear that lived in the back of her throat like a stone she could not swallow. But she did not stop walking, and she did not turn back, because this was the moment Falk had been preparing her for. This was the moment her mother had died for. This was the moment that would decide whether Ren of Ember Hollow was just an Omega who mended torn things, or something more. She reached the entrance to the great hall, and she stepped inside, and the noise and the light and the heat of it washed over her like a wave. The hall was alive, every corner bright with firelight, every surface warm with the heat of too many bodies in a large space. The long stone tables were filled with wolves eating and drinking and laughing, and at the head of the central table, sitting on his raised stone seat, was Corvus. He looked exactly as he always looked in that seat, broad and still and faintly remote, his amber eyes making their slow rounds of the room. And he did not look at Ren, not once, because they had agreed he would not, because a king's eyes on an Omega across a feast hall was the kind of small, strange thing that a careful man would notice. And the assassin was nothing if not careful. Ren moved along the edge of the hall toward the passage entrance, and she picked up a water jug from a side table, and she positioned herself where she could see the whole room, where she could track the wood carriers making their trips to the store, where she could watch the inner council members at their places near the king, where she could see everything that mattered. And then she waited. The feast moved through its first hour the way great feasts always did, food and drink and the warm rising noise of many wolves talking at once, the particular music of a hall full of people who were well-fed and well-warmed and felt safe and important. Ren stood with her water jug and watched, and she counted. The first trip to the wood store happened 20 minutes into the feast. A young servant with a carry harness brought a load of timber from the front of the stack and fed it into the nearest fire pit. The flames rose, the warmth rolled across the tables, and the guests barely noticed. The second trip happened 15 minutes later. More timber from the middle of the stack, the safe wood, the old wood, not the hollow log, not yet. Wren watched the servants, and she watched the inner council. Hadrian was drinking heavily, more than the others. His face was flushed, and his hands shook slightly when he raised his cup. Guilty hands, nervous hands. Rorik, the head warrior, sat solid and calm, watching the room the way a warrior always watches, looking for threats, but looking in the wrong places. Sable, the chief advisor, was speaking quietly to the elder beside her. Her face was sharp and focused. No fear in it, no guilt. Idris, the spiritual elder, had his eyes half closed, listening to something only he could hear, or pretending to. And Bryony, Corvus's cousin, sat near the end of the table, beautiful and poised and smiling, but her eyes were not smiling. Her eyes were watching Corvus, and there was something in that watching that made Wren's skin prickle. The third trip to the wood store, the fourth, each time the servant reached deeper into the stack, getting closer. And across the hall along the far wall, the wood carrier stood among the lower-ranked attendants, plain-faced and unremarkable, and his pale eyes were moving, covering the room in those familiar sections, measuring distances, reading angles. Wren watched him, and she felt the knife against her ribs, and she counted her own heartbeats to keep herself steady. The fifth trip to the wood store, the servant's arm reaching deeper now, almost to the back, and the wood carrier began to move. Not fast, not in any way that would draw attention, just a slow drift along the wall, closing the distance between himself and the central table, between himself and Corvus. Wren's hands tightened on the water jug. Not yet, not yet. The sixth trip. The servant reached to the very back of the stack, and Wren saw his hands close around the hollow log, and everything inside her went quiet and cold and perfectly still. The servant carried the hollow log across the hall, and he placed it into the fire pit nearest the king's seat, and the log began to burn, and the ember roots sealed inside it began to heat, and the poison that would stop a wolf's heart began to rise with the smoke. Wren set down the water jug, slowly, carefully, without a sound, and she began to move. Across the hall, the wood carrier was moving too, faster now, his hand drifting toward the blade at his hip, the blade that no one had noticed because no one had been looking for it. Wolves near the fire pit were beginning to cough, just lightly, just enough to cause confusion. And in that confusion, in that moment when every eye in the hall turned toward the fire, the assassin made his move. He cut through the crowd like water through stone, smooth and fast and certain. His blade was in his hand, and Corvus's back was to him, and the distance between them was closing. 5 body lengths, 4, 3, and Wren was moving too, faster than she had ever moved in her life, cutting through the crowd from the other side, her hand finding the knife in her wrap, her eyes locked on the pale-eyed man who had killed 11 kings and thought he would kill one more. 2 body lengths. The assassin raised his blade, and Wren closed the final distance between them. She did not shout, did not warn him, did not give him a single moment to turn or adjust or understand that he had been seen. She drove the bone knife into his back with every ounce of strength she possessed, just below the right shoulder, just where Falk had taught her, the place where the blade would slip between the ribs and find the lung and end the threat cleanly and completely. The assassin made a sound, short and airless, exactly the sound Wren had been told to expect, and he began to fall. Wren went down with him, her hand still on the knife, controlling the fall so it would not crash into the table or knock a cup to the floor or make any sound louder than the chaos of a feast in full voice. She brought him to the cold stone floor, and she held him there, her knees on the stone, her hands steady on the blade, her face completely clear, and she looked at his pale, close-set eyes, and he looked at hers. And neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say, and the time for saying things was not this moment. Wren watched his eyes go from sharp to clouded to distant, and she held her position. And the feast went on around them for 3 full breaths before anyone at the nearest table happened to look down and see what was there. Then the sound went through the hall the way sounds like that always go, fast and in every direction at once, and the feast broke apart into standing wolves and drawn blades and the hard voices of guards pushing through the crowd, and Wren stayed exactly where she was, on the cold stone floor of the great hall of Blackthorn Keep, with the water jug sitting on the table above her and the knife in her steady hand, and the assassin who had never once been seen lying on the floor before her. Seen at last, stopped at last, by the one wolf in all the Grey March that no one had ever thought to count. The guards reached Ren within moments, large men with hard faces and hands that knew how to control a threat. They pulled her to her feet with more force than was necessary, and they pulled the knife from her grip, and they held her between two broad bodies while the hall erupted into chaos around them. Ren let them hold her. She had expected this. An Omega crouched over a bleeding man on the floor of the king's feast hall was not a picture that invited careful handling, and she understood that the guards were doing what guards always did when something went wrong. They were securing the threat first and asking questions later. But she was not afraid. Her hands were steady, her breathing was calm, and her eyes were already moving past the guards who held her, tracking across the hall to find Corvus. He was standing at the head of the central table. He had risen when the sound went through the room, and now he stood looking at the floor where the assassin lay, and his face was the same unreadable stone it always was. But his eyes were moving, reading the room in those slow amber sweeps, taking in the positions of his guards, the placement of his guests, the body on the floor, and the woman held between his two largest warriors. And he was very still, in the way that powerful things go very still when they are processing something important. One of the senior guards, a wide-shouldered beta named Rorik, who had been with Corvus for 9 of his 11 years of rule, crouched beside the assassin. He checked the wound, then he checked the man's face. Then he reached inside the man's clothing with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. And what he found there made him go very still for a moment before he rose and turned to Corvus. "My king," Rorik said, and his voice carried across the hall in the sudden quiet that had fallen after the chaos. "This man carries 3 more blades in a sealed vessel of ember root paste, and he is not on any supply roster I have ever signed." The hall was very quiet by then, the kind of quiet that comes after chaos when everyone is still standing and still breathing fast, but the noise has gone out of the room like air from a punctured skin. Rorik looked at Ren, then back at Corvus, and he said in a voice that was flat and strange. She stopped him. Corvus walked the length of the hall. He did not hurry and he did not slow. He simply walked it the way he walked every space, as though the space belonged to him and had always belonged to him. And the crowd parted ahead of him and stayed parted behind him, and everyone watched him come. He stopped in front of Ren, and the 2 guards holding her looked at him. And he looked back at them with those amber eyes, and they released her arms and stepped aside. And then it was just Corvus and Ren in the middle of the great hall of Blackthorn Keep, with every ranked wolf in the Grey March watching them from every direction. Corvus looked at her for a long moment, and she looked at the side of his jaw. And the hall was so quiet that the sound of the fire pits was clear and steady in the air between them. Then Corvus said, "You knew he was here before you told me." It was not a question. Ren said yes. He said, "You knew what he planned and when he planned to do it." She said yes. He said, "And you said nothing to my guards, and moved nothing in the hall, and let it run until tonight." She said yes. He was quiet again, and then he said why, and his voice was level. But there was something underneath it, something she had not heard in it before, something that was not anger and was not relief exactly, but was somewhere between those two things. Ren said, "Because a plan that is known to many becomes a plan that leaks, and a plan that leaks becomes a different plan, and the different plan is always the one you have not found." She paused, and then she said, "And because I needed him to run what he had prepared, so that I could be where I needed to be when he ran it." Corvus looked at her for another long moment and said nothing. Then he looked down at the assassin on the floor and back at her, and he said quietly so that only she and the nearest wolves could hear it clearly, "You saved my life, Ren of Ember Hollow." Ren said nothing, because it was true, and she did not feel the need to dress it up or push it away. Corvus said, "And you did it alone, and you did it without rank. And you did it in a way that not one of my trained warriors managed to do." His voice was still level, but the thing underneath it had come slightly closer to the surface, and Ren could read it now clearly. And what it was something very close to wonder. The hall was still watching. Every alpha and beta and ranked wolf in that room was watching an Omega woman stand in front of the most feared king in the Grey March and hear him say those words. And the silence in the room was not the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of something shifting, the way the ground shifts when something very heavy moves underground, slow and deep and impossible to stop once it has started. Ren looked directly at Corvus, and she said, "I meant torn things. That is what I do." And something moved in his face then, just briefly, just at the edges. The thing that she had learned in her days of reading him was the closest he ever came to something warm. And he said, "Yes, you do." And the hall breathed again, all at once, like something had been held and then released. They kept the assassin alive through the night, Because a dead assassin answers no questions, and Corvus wanted answers. Rorik and two of the senior guards took the man to the lower room beneath the hall, and they worked through the dark hours. And by the time the first gray light of morning was coming through the high vents in the ceiling, they had the shape of it. The assassin's real name was not Durik. It had not been Durik in a very long time. And before that name, it had been other names in other halls in other territories. And every one of those names had belonged to a man that people remembered as plain-faced and ordinary and completely unremarkable. Right up until something terrible happened. His true name, the one he had been born with before he learned to shed names like a snake sheds skin, was Sylvan. Sylvan the patient, they had called him in the old days. Before he became the shadow. Before he became the nightmare that kings whispered about in their private chambers. He had been working his trade for 30 years. 3 full generations of hiring. Passing from one lord's gold to another's. Moving through the territories like wind through grass, leaving no trace, no pattern, no way to predict where he would surface next or who would fall when he did. The list of names that Rorik brought to Corvus in the early morning was a list that made the king read it twice, and then set it face down on the stone table, and sit very still for a long moment. 11 Alpha Kings, 11 stone seats left empty, and not one guard, not one warrior, not one advisor sharp enough to see him coming. Until Ren. Ren was not in the room when Rorik brought the list. She was in her small room near the grain stores, sitting on her straw mat with her steady hands in her lap, and she was thinking about going home. The task she had been brought to Blackthorn Keep to do was finished, and she was an Omega from a lower quarter pack. And the world did not change its shape overnight just because an Omega had done a remarkable thing inside its walls. And Ren understood this the way she understood most things, clearly and without flinching. She had done what she came to do, and now she would go back to Ember Hollow, and she would mend torn things. And the story would be told without her in it the way most stories were told about Omegas, around the outside of what they had done rather than through the center of it. She was thinking this when the knock came at her door. It was not Rorik, and it was not one of the senior guards. And it was not the advisor with the sharp eyes. It was Corvus. He stood in the doorway of her small room near the grain stores in the plain morning light, without any of the trappings of rank that he wore in the hall. Just a large and tired man with dark unbound hair and amber eyes that were still sharp even through the long night they had kept. He looked at the small room, and at the straw mat, and at the plain cloth of her wrap, and at her steady hands in her lap. And he said, "May I come in?" And his voice was quiet, the way it had been quiet in the inner room 3 days ago, without the weight of the hall behind it. Ren said yes, and he came in, and he sat on the grain sack against the wall because the room had no second seat. And Ren looked at the side of his jaw and waited. He said, "The man who hired Sylvan is one of my own inner council." He said it simply, without decoration. The way Ren had told him about the hollow log and the torch bracket 3 days ago. Just the shape of the thing, clean and complete. Ren said, "I know." Corvus looked at her, and he said, "How long have you known?" She said, "Since the second day, when I saw the bone carving in the wall behind your seat." And she told him what the carving was, a signal marker. A small sign cut in a code she had learned as a child from an old wolf in Ember Hollow who had once served a great warlord in the Eastern Territories, and who had passed the time of his retirement teaching a quiet Omega girl the things he had learned about how shadows communicated with the people who hired them. Corvus listened, and he said nothing until she was finished. And then he said, "You knew there was someone inside my council, and you still said nothing until you were ready." Ren said yes. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "It was Hadrian, the trade master. He confessed an hour ago." Ren nodded. She had known. She had seen the way Hadrian and Sylvan had stood together in the yard, the language of conspiracy written in the space between them. Corvus said, "He wanted me dead so he could install a puppet king, someone he could control, someone who would let him profit from trade routes I had closed because they were bleeding the lower packs dry." He looked at his hands, large hands, scarred from years of fighting, and he said, "He has been with me for 7 years. I trusted him." Ren said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that kind of betrayal, nothing that would make it smaller or easier to carry. Corvus looked up at her, and he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer either way changes nothing about what you have already done here, and what you have already done here will not be forgotten." Ren waited. He said, "Stay in Blackthorn Keep, not as a servant, and not as an attendant, and not in a room near the grain stores." He said, "I have an inner council with a seat on it that is going to be empty before this day is finished. And I have a hall full of ranked wolves who are very skilled at the things that ranked wolves are skilled at. And I have a threat out in every direction that comes not from strength, but from the quiet and patient work of people I cannot see until it is almost too late. He looked at her steadily, and he said, I need someone who sees what others miss, and who is never wrong about what they see, and who makes decisions based on what is true rather than what is ranked. He said, I need you, Ren. The morning light was pale and clean through the narrow window, and Ren looked at her hands for a moment, those steady hands that had mended torn things in a lower quarter hut for as long as she could remember. And she thought about Ember Hollow, and the tanning smell when the wind turned wrong, and the straw mat she slept on, and the errand boy who had not looked at her when he delivered the summons that changed everything. She thought about the thing that had been sleeping inside her, that old and sharp and quiet thing that Falk had named and nurtured. And she thought about how it had felt to finally let it wake, how it had felt to move through these walls with a purpose that matched what she was rather than apologizing for it, how it had felt to stand on that stone floor in the middle of the great feast hall and look directly at the most feared king in the Grey March and know that she had saved his life. She thought about all of it, and then she looked at the side of Corvus's jaw, and then she looked directly into his amber eyes, and she said, I will need a proper seat at the council table. Something moved in his face again, that warm thing at the edges, and he said, you will have it. She said, and I will need to move freely through every part of these walls at every hour, without question and without escort. He said, agreed. She said, and I will not be ranked, because rank is not what I am, and pretending otherwise would make me less useful to you, not more. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, agreed. And his voice was careful and honest in the way that voices are when they are saying something that costs them a comfortable assumption. Ren nodded once, and he nodded once, and that was the agreement they made, in a small room near the grain stores in the plain morning light, with no ceremony and no witnesses and no one to mark it down in the old records, because it was not the kind of thing the old records had a page for, an Omega given a seat at the Alpha King's inner council. Not as a servant, and not as a decoration, and not as a thing that someone had decided to be generous about, but as the most necessary wolf in the hall, because she was the only one who had seen the assassin, and she had seen him before he could finish what he came to do, and she had ended him on the floor of the great hall in front of every ranked wolf in the Grey March, without flinching and without failing. Corvus stood, and he looked down at Ren, and he said, there is one more thing. Ren waited. He said, you asked me to trust you, and I did, and you were right. He paused, and then he said, now I am asking you to trust me, not because I command it, but because I am asking, and he held out his hand. Ren looked at it, large and rough and scarred, and she looked at his face, and she saw something there that she had not seen before, something that was not the king, not the stone seat, not the feared name, just a man who was tired and grateful and trying very hard to say something he did not have the words for. She took his hand, and he helped her to her feet, and they stood there in the small room, and the light came through the window. And for a moment, they were just two wolves who had survived something together. Then Corvus said, stay close, Ren of Ember Hollow, because I have a feeling this is only the beginning. And Ren said, I will, and she meant it. The public assembly happened at midday, in the Great Hall, with every pack that owed allegiance to Corvus in attendance, and every wolf who had been at the feast the night before, and many who had not been there but had heard what happened and wanted to see the Omega who had saved the king. The hall was packed, standing room only, and the noise was a low rumble like distant thunder. Anticipation and confusion and the particular energy of a crowd that knows something important is about to happen but does not yet know what. Corvus sat on his stone seat, and his inner council sat at the table below him, 4 seats now instead of 5, because Hadrian's seat was empty, and would stay empty until this was finished. Ren stood to the side, not at the council table, not yet, just near enough to be seen, and far enough to still be apart. Corvus raised one hand, and the hall went quiet. He said, you all know what happened last night. An assassin entered this hall during the gathering feast. He planned to kill me, and he would have succeeded. His voice was level, carrying clearly to every corner of the room. He said the assassin's name was Sylvan. Some of you knew him as the Shadow. He had killed 11 Alpha Kings before last night. He had walked through the best-guarded halls in the Grey March, and no one had ever seen him coming, and no one had ever stopped him. Corvus looked across the hall, and he said, until last night. He gestured toward Ren, and every eye in the hall turned to her. He said, this woman is Ren of Ember Hollow. She is an Omega. She has no rank, no title, no training as a warrior. But she saw what my finest guards did not see. She found what my sharpest advisors did not find. And when the moment came, she did what no one else in this hall was able to do. The hall was absolutely silent. Corvus said she saved my life, and in doing so, she proved something that I think we have all forgotten. that worth is not measured by rank. He stood, and he walked down from his seat. And he crossed to where Ren stood, and he said loud enough for everyone to hear Ren of Ember Hollow, "I offer you a seat at my inner council, not as a favor, and not as a gesture, but because you have earned it, and because this hall needs you." There was a sound then, not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur, just a collective breath of a room full of wolves trying to process something they had never imagined. And then one of the alphas in the crowd spoke, a large man with gray in his beard and the colors of the northern packs on his shoulders. He said in Omega, "At the King's Council, this is madness." Another voice joined his, and then another, the hall beginning to fracture into argument. But Corvus did not move, and he did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the alphas who had spoken, and he said, "I do not ask your permission." The hall went quiet again. He said, "Ren has proven her worth. She has my trust, and she will have the seat. The only question is whether she will accept it." And he turned to Ren, and he waited. Ren stood in the middle of the great hall of Blackthorn Keep, with hundreds of eyes on her, with the weight of a decision that would change everything pressing down on her shoulders. And she thought about her mother, and she thought about Falk, and she thought about every Omega who had ever been told they were the last word in a sentence no one bothered to finish. And she looked at Corvus, and she said, "I accept." The hall erupted, some in anger, some in shock, and some a smaller number, but growing in something that might have been approval. But Ren did not hear any of it, because Corvus was smiling, just slightly, just at the edges, and he was holding out his hand again, and she was taking it, and he was leading her to the empty seat at the council table, and she was sitting down, in a seat that had never held an Omega before, in a hall that had never imagined such a thing was possible. And the world was shifting beneath them all, slow and deep and impossible to stop. 6 months passed, and the world did not end, and the hall did not fall, and Ren sat at the council table and did exactly what Corvus had asked her to do. She saw what others missed, and she spoke truth when truth was needed, and she taught the guards to look beyond rank and reputation, to see the small things that mattered beneath the loud things that distracted. 3 more threats came to Blackthorn Keep in those 6 months, none of them as sophisticated as Sylvan's plan, but all of them dangerous, and Ren found every one of them before they could take root. A poisoned gift from a rival pack, a false advisor with a blade hidden in his walking stick, a servant bribed to leave a door unlocked at midnight. Ren saw them all, and she stopped them all. And slowly, grudgingly, the hall began to understand that Corvus had been right to trust her. And something else began to happen, something Ren had not expected. Omegas from other packs began to arrive at Blackthorn Keep, asking to speak with Ren, asking to learn from her. Young women with wide eyes and quiet voices who had spent their whole lives being told they were nothing, and who had heard the story of the Omega who saved the king, and who wanted to believe that maybe they could be something more. Ren taught them, not how to fight, but how to see, how to notice, how to trust what they noticed, even when no one else believed them. And she watched them grow stronger, not louder, but surer. And it filled something in her chest that she had not known was empty. And Corvus watched her teach, and he saw the change spreading through his territory, like roots through soil. Omegas asking for training, asking for positions in the guard, asking to be counted. And he saw the packs that resisted, and the packs that adapted. And he adjusted his policies accordingly, rewarding the ones who valued merit over rank, and distancing himself from the ones who did not. The Grey March was changing, slowly, but changing, and at the center of it all was Ren, still quiet, still plain-clothed, still looking slightly to the side of people's faces when she spoke, but no longer invisible, no longer the last word in an unfinished sentence. She was the beginning of something, and everyone knew it. On a cool afternoon in late autumn, Ren was walking the gardens of Blackthorn Keep with Corvus. It had become a habit between them. Once a week after the council meetings, they would walk the grounds together, and they would talk, not about policy or threats or the business of ruling, just about small things, the turning of the seasons, the old stories their teachers had told them, the shape of clouds on the horizon. Corvus said, "Any regrets leaving Ember Hollow?" Ren thought about it, and she said, "I go back twice a month, to teach, to show the young Omegas there that they are not powerless." She paused, and she said, "But no regrets." Corvus smiled, and he said, "You have changed the Grey March, Ren. Omegas are enrolling in guard training now. 3 other packs have offered council seats to Omegas in the last 2 months." Ren said, "Good. Rank should not define worth." They walked in silence for a moment, and then Corvus said quietly, "I am glad you stayed." Ren looked at him, and she saw something in his face that she had been seeing more and more in recent months. Something that was not just gratitude, not just respect, but something warmer, something that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She said, I am glad I stayed too. Corvus stopped walking, and he turned to face her. And he said, I have been meaning to ask you something, for weeks now, but I have not known how. Ren waited. He said, that night, when I offered you the council seat, you said you would not be ranked. That rank was not what you were. Ren nodded. Corvus said, I have been thinking about that, about what you are, if not ranked. He paused, and then he said, I think you are the bravest wolf I have ever met, and the most necessary, and I would like to know you better. Not as king and advisor, but as us. Ren looked at him, and she felt something shift in her chest, the same way the ground had shifted in the hall 6 months ago when Corvus had named her in front of everyone. A slow and deep movement that could not be stopped once it started. She said, ask me again in 6 months, after we both know this is real. And not just gratitude, or relief, or the echo of a moment that has already passed. Corvus looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled. A real smile this time, full and warm, and he said, I will wait. And they kept walking, and the leaves fell around them, and the world kept turning, and Ren felt for the first time in her life like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. A messenger arrived at the gates of Blackthorn Keep 3 days later, carrying a letter sealed with wax and marked with symbols that made the gate guards send for Corvus immediately. Corvus read the letter in his private chambers, and then he sent for Ren. She came, and he handed her the letter without a word. Ren read it, and her face did not change. But her eyes sharpened, and she said, how long do we have? Corvus said 2 weeks, maybe less. The letter was a threat from the Northern Territories, a new player rising in the power structure there, someone who had heard about Sylvan's failure and who wanted to prove they could succeed where the Shadow had not. Ren set the letter down on the table, and she said, I will need access to the trade records from the Northern Pacts and a list of everyone who has entered Blackthorn Keep in the last month. Corvus said, you will have them by morning. Ren nodded, and she turned to leave. But Corvus said, Ren. She stopped. He said, what would I do without you? And Ren looked back at him, and she said, you will never have to find out. And she meant it, because this was her place now, not Ember Hollow, not the lower quarter, here, at Corvus's side, seeing what others missed, stopping what others could not stop, being the thing that no one had ever expected her to be, essential. And the moon kept turning, and the fires kept burning, and Blackthorn Keep stood strong on its hill, protected not just by warriors and walls and the strength of its king, but by a quiet woman with steady hands and eyes that saw everything. And the Grey March would never be the same. They would tell Ren's story for generations after, in every pack that owed allegiance to Corvus, and in packs that did not, and in territories so far from Blackthorn Keep that the name of the place had never been heard before. They would tell it the way the oldest and truest stories are told, not as a lesson and not as a warning exactly, but as a thing that happened and mattered and refused to be made smaller by the telling. They would say that the most feared Alpha King in the ancient lands of the Grey March had been saved not by his warriors and not by his walls, but by an Omega from the lower quarter, a woman with plain cloth and braided hair and wide dark eyes and hands that were always steady, who had seen what no one else could see and done what no one else had done. Ren of Ember Hollow, the Omega who saw the assassin, the wolf who saved a king, the one that no one had counted until the night it cost everything not to. And all across the Grey March in lower quarters and small villages and quiet huts where Omegas mended torn things and kept their eyes down, young women were hearing her story, and they were looking up, and they were beginning to believe that maybe they could be more than the last word in an unfinished sentence. They could be the beginning. This is the story of Ren, the Omega who stopped the Shadow, the woman who changed the Grey March, the one who proved that invisibility could be a weapon, and that the last word in a sentence could become the first word of something new. And it will not let you rest easy now that you have heard it, because it asks a question that every person must answer for themselves. What would you do if you saw what others missed? Would you speak? Would you act? Would you risk everything to do what was right, even when the world told you that you were nothing? Ren answered that question on a stone floor in a great hall, with a knife in her steady hand and a king's life hanging in the balance, and her answer changed everything. What will yours be?